Always a pleasure to be allowed to participate in these big read introductions. And I realized preparing this slideshow, it was about a year ago that I did a presentation on some of the Phineas Redux chapters. So I was actually realizing it's another fall, and here we are. So these particular chapters are very rich. There's all sorts of activity going on in them. And I've chosen to frame it as lots of confrontations and conversations and changing views and some unchanging views, plus a nasty writing accident and a kind of a typical Trollope move, a reuniting with some of our old friends from earlier Palliser books like The Malls and the Chilterns and Mr. Spooner, who now has a wife. So just to give an overview of the themes I'm going to talk about, and then I'll go through them in more detail. We see Lady Mary holding firm in her love for Frank, while the Duke, by the end of these chapters, describes himself as half conquered toward consenting to the marriage. And there's a chapter called Three Attacks, which describes what's kind of weakening his resolve. We see Lady Mabel launch what she calls a forlorn hope, making one final pitch to win Silverbridge, knowing it probably won't work. We see Silverbridge reject her. We see Silverbridge tell his father finally that Isabel, not Lady Mabel, is his intended bride. And we have a very rich discussion on what honor and duty and nobility require. Isabel ups her game with Silverbridge, saying her father has to come to her and ask her to be his daughter-in-law, and then she'll be the proudest woman in the world, etc. We see Silverbridge mature politically. He gives hints that he intends to return to the Liberal Party. He even seeks his father's advice on whether he should give a political speech seconding the address of beeswax. Um, we see the Duke having to lecture Gerald about the evils of gambling after he gets into an awful scrape, and the Duke despairs at ever indoctrinating his children properly. And then at a hunting party where we meet some old friends from other Palliser novels, Frank Tregear has a very serious fall, which is caused in part by Silverbridge's handling of his own horse. And finally, I'm taking this a little out of sequence, Major Tifto faces more consequences for his misdeeds. So to begin with the Mary plot and what develops with Mary during this time, here she's being comforted by Mrs. Finn and is still from the Pallisers. Lady Mary asserts to Mrs. Finn in very dramatic language that he has no right, her father, to treat her this way, and he wouldn't be allowed to kill her, and yet this treatment is killing her. So she's very dramatic and very firm about her love and how she feels she's being wronged by her father. She reports that she feels old and life just feels like a blank because she's being kept from Frank with no hope. And Mrs. Finn says, where there's life, there's hope, but Mary's feeling pretty hopeless. She has a very dramatic screaming fit when she learns of Tregear's accident. And the Duke at this point makes an important concession. He says, I believe him to be a worthy young man. By this time, he's been elected to Parliament, so that we know is a very important coin of the realm for the Duke, but he hasn't changed his position. However, after 3 attacks on the Duke, including an incredible conversation with Mrs. Finn, where she basically says to the Duke, I really think you should let her marry Frank, and I really think this could result in her languishing and dying 20 years from now, a withered person. And the Duke really he's just throbbing with the reaction to this conversation. And he tells Mrs. Finn what a dear friend she is, not only to him, but to Mary, and how much he appreciates her counsel. He gets a letter from Frank Tregear, who's, says, look, I've got to do something. Your daughter's faithful to me. And if she's faithful to me and I'm faithful to her, what good does it do to not relent? And then Mary kind of just caresses him and wants to go to the station with him. And he realizes how much he needs love. and how much he's missed Mary's love, and how much he's missed someone to caress ever since his wife died. And so suddenly, although he doesn't say to her, "Oh, it's fine, you can marry Frank," she senses something's changed. And she senses her troubles will soon end, even though she says, "I don't mean to be disobedient, but I can't marry someone I don't love, and you wouldn't want me to." So there are very significant developments with the Mary plot. And interestingly, and I don't know if anyone else picked up on this, the Duke has changed his mind about whether somehow loving Frank has ruined his daughter in some way, because in chapter 11, he regarded Mary's misplaced affection for Tregear as a disgrace which he could not bring his tongue to utter to another man. And he remembers his own marriage when he's told that by Mrs. Lady Cantrip that he should send Mary out in the marriage market and find someone else. This somehow disturbs him because he thinks that while it worked to find Glencora a husband, namely him, he fears somehow that sending Mary out on the marriage market will cause her to lose something of the bloom of her innocence. Now, by chapter 66, we're told that it had never seemed to him that Mary had disgraced herself by loving Tregear. And at this point, he's pretty fed up with his sons. And while he thinks their behavior has degraded them, the gambling, the racing, the losses at the racetrack, this girl would always be pure, no matter who she marries. So this is a very interesting change in Plantagenet's thinking by this point in the book. He seems to think back, "I've never thought that she disgraced herself," but in chapter 11, he certainly did think it was a disgrace. Meanwhile, Lady Mabel makes a last effort at Silverbridge. She knows it's basically hopeless, but she can't help but try. And she also knows, as she puts it, that she's going to have to be bold and sudden and unwomanlike, and yet display women's charm that he should discover no want. She must be false, but with perfect deceit, that he would regard her as a pearl of truth. Footnote later, Silverbridge describes Isabel as a pearl, right? But here Mabel has to kind of put on this show and be persuasive. But in fact, he's baffled when she says that when she laughed at him before, she actually loved him, and she's loved him for some time. And you might today say she's kind of gaslighting him, because when he did make these declarations, she thought he was immature. She decided to spare him. She realized she could never worship him like she worshiped Frank. So basically, he rejects her argument about what's fitting for him to marry within his class. And when she says, "I'm wretched," he said, "No, you're Lady Mabel Grex, admired by everyone." And then she sort of takes a new tact and says, "Well, if I am Lady Mabel Grex, what do you owe me?" I mean, in other words, he somehow mistreated her the way he seemed to be proposing to her and wanted to marry her, and then he didn't propose to her. But he basically says to her, when she says, "This is unbecoming for you to marry outside your rank," that he would give it all up for love. And when he makes this declaration of love for Isabel, no matter what, she says, well, he's become a man. Because before, remember, her problem with him is he was pretty immature still, and she didn't think she could really look up to him. So she fails. And I wanted to step back for a minute and think a little bit about Trollope's treatment of Lady Mabel versus Isabel von Cassen, and what this suggests to us about his views about women and love and marriage. And to prepare for this talk, my research assistant got me some older sources on this novel. And one of the things I found was about half a century old, called Anthony Trollope on the Genus Girl. And some of the observations the author makes, and we probably know this without reading his views, but just to bring them up. It's Trollope's idea that woman, unlike man, can love but once, and indeed, she will love her lover forever, even if she doesn't wish to. And that certainly would describe the dilemma that Mabel finds herself in vis-a-vis Frank. Women should also worship their love object like a god. Compare the way Isabel thinks about Silverbridge versus the way Mabel thinks about him and the way Mabel thinks about Frank. And a woman who has once loved a man will forever be married to him in her heart, even if she doesn't wish to be. And again, This is like Lily Dale for the weak Adolphus Crosby. And then finally, women like Lady Mabel, Lady Laura, Caroline Waddington, and Julie Brabazon. I know we did Phineas together, so you probably know Lady Laura. They don't marry the men they love because they're poor, but then they suffer for it. Lady Mabel suffers because she fatally hesitates in her plot to marry Silverbridge until it's too late because he meets Isabel and falls for her. The other three suffer because they make unhappy marriages for status and money, right? All these marriages end unhappily. But some Trollope heroines who can't marry their first love can learn to love their husbands in time. And that's the story of Lady Glencora. And that's the narrative the Duke initially thinks can apply to Mary. That she can find someone. It was good for Lady Glencora to be or have a marriage arranged. It could be good for her daughter as well. Now, Lady Mabel herself realizes the gains and losses of her final campaign for Silverbridge. She says, "What could I lose? The sweet bloom of her maiden shame," she asked. But then she says, "I lost that when I gave my heart to Frank, and I've never recovered it." And she also understands that this most exquisite feminine charm, the bloom of her maiden shame, she already lost it when she decided that loving one man, she was willing to marry another. Now, and I read this passage in chapter 59. I couldn't help but think of the concluding chapter of Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, because in the book version, not the incredibly great movie version, which ends differently, in the book version, Thornton has come to see Margaret Hale, who has a business proposition to save his mill. And he basically grasped that even though she says it's just a business proposition to lend him all her fortune, basically at low interest, it's actually a sign that she loves him. So he's literally crawling on his knees against the room to get up to her and starts talking to her. And she kind of buries her face in his shoulder. And when she raises her face, she is glowing with beautiful shame. So I'm not a 19th century scholar, but I'd love to hear more about what it meant when these maidens blushed with shame. Anyway, okay. So another question I had is whether Silverbridge's new insights on Lady Mabel versus Isabel reflect Trollope's own gender norms. For example, in chapter 68, at the very end of his meeting with Isabel, where she's basically given him this ultimatum that have your father come say to me wants to be his daughter-in-law, he reflects, Trollope says he kind of comes to the truth about the difference between these women. And basically, Lady Mabel's a manufactured article. She's a creature of efforts. And she strives to be graceful, lively, and agreeable and clever. But Isabel was all of this infinitely more without any struggle. And Lady Mabel had always seemed to him older, even though she was younger than him. And something was gone of her native bloom, again, like the maidenly shame and the glow, something that was scratched and chapped from the first fair surface, replaced and repaired by varnish and veneering. He doesn't say she paints, which is really bad when women apply face paint. But he doesn't know yet about how passionate her love for Tregear was, but he sees the effects of the love. Whereas Isabel, the lucky girl, is as young as Hebe, the goddess of youth. So here's a contrast between the two women. So then looking at another major source of change and development in these chapters, there's major and momentous conversations between the Duke and his older son, Silverbridge. One is about Isabel. And the Duke admonishes Silverbridge, doesn't honor mean anything? Doesn't duty mean anything to you? Doesn't nobility mean anything to you? And Silverbridge says, why don't I have freedom like any other person to marry the woman I love? I can certainly marry her under law. And the Duke has this fascinating passage, which I guess I, as a lawyer and law professor, found really interesting, basically saying, you don't want to come near the law. You don't want to live your life based on what the law permits. You want to live based on duty and honor and conduct yourself properly. And what about your duty to the aristocracy, right? And so there's this interesting conversation where Silverbridge takes the same language and turns it back to the dupe, saying, I'm bound in honor and duty and nobility to honor my promise that I made to Isabel, right? Um, so that's the first really interesting conversation between the Duke and his son. Meanwhile, I don't know how many of you read Framley Parsonage, one of the Barchester books, but this tactic Trollope uses that Isabel says, have your father ask me to be his daughter-in-law, and then I'll be proud as a queen. Well, in Framley Parsonage, Lady Lufton's quite up in arms because Lord Lufton, her son, has fallen in love with Lucy Robarts, who Lady Lufton does not think is distinguished enough, and she still holds out hopes that Lord Lufton will marry the Grantley's oldest daughter, who later marries Lord Dumbello. He's got this kind of beautiful but seemingly empty woman. And Lucy says, I'll marry you when your mother comes to me and asks me to be her daughter. So he thinks, oh my God, this is never going to happen. But, well, I won't spoil the plot. But anyway, that's the challenge. So Silverbridge also has matured politically. And he's realizing he hates Timothy Beeswax. He calls him a beast, but in more general, he's not sure he agrees with the party's positions. So when he's asked to second the address in the opening session, he asks the Duke's advice because he fears that this is only being offered to him to humiliate his father. And the Duke gives a very interesting speech about political life and obligations, saying just because you hate the party leader, that's no reason not to give this speech. I would hope that you would look into your party's positions and stand for them and back them. And even though I'm disappointed you didn't choose the Liberal Party, I admire work and you should devote yourself to work. And then when Silverbridge voices his suspicions that this is just being done to humiliate the Duke, then the Duke is on board with helping him write a letter declining to give the address, because it's very important that Silverbridge not stand up for something that he doesn't believe in. And so by the end of this conversation, the Duke seems to have won a small victory, which is his son is leaning toward going back to the Liberals. And later when he talks to Gerald, he basically says, I'm going to change again. It's the least I can do for the governor to make him happy. So, okay. So then I have to laugh. We have a chapter about Gerald getting into an awful scrape, losing at cards to Percival. And I don't know if anyone else shared my thought. Why is the Duke so eager for his son to be married to Mabel, given that she's got the same blood that flows in Percival's veins, and he's certainly not very admirable, and neither is his father. So how important is aristocratic blood anyway, if it's devoid of character in Percival's case? So Gerald Silverbridge is going to help Gerald out by giving Percival an IOU for a couple of months. But Gerald decides to just go right to the governor and tell him all. And then we get this very stern lecture from the Duke, who just says, why do people gamble? It's horrible that you would gamble. And as Gerald later tells it, there he was spouting Latin too. I mean, he gives quite a severe lecture, and Gerald feels abashed, but he certainly appreciates the Duke's concern, and the Duke pays the debt, of course. And just like with Silverbridge's outrageous loss because of the sabotage of the force, the Duke thinks, look, if this episode will cure him of doing this, then what's the money, right? And in this chapter, chapter 65, the readers get this benefit of the Duke's internal monologue. He just charts all his woes with his daughter, his older son, this son, and reflects on how completely he's failed to indoctrinate his children with the ideas by which his own mind was fortified and controlled. You see this kind of generational conflict. And he's so thoroughly crushed and disappointed by his own household that he can barely bring himself to care about public service, which used to be the mainspring of almost all his actions. Okay. So meanwhile, Tregear is persuaded to go hunting and suffers a terrible injury caused in part by Silverbridge, because Silverbridge's horse can't, he has to jump because Silverbridge's horse won't stop. And so he doesn't make the jump. And then the worst thing, Silverbridge's horse falls on him. He's broken ribs. He's broken an arm. He's badly bruised. So just a question. I don't know why this was necessary to advance the plot. Certainly we've seen riding accidents where the unfortunate person dies outright. A number of Trollope novels have these fatal deaths from riding accidents. But why have this, and why have Silverbridge be the source of the injury? In any case, he's laid up. He has to write to, Silverbridge has to write to people about the accident. He himself writes to Lady Mabel. So, I'm sorry, Silverbridge also writes to Lady Mabel. So we can talk about Tregear more in a minute, but this is kind of a fun Trollope plot device where you come to the end of a series, like with Barchester, and just bring a bunch of people together, right? Let's have a party. So Lady and Lord Chiltern are there. Lord Chiltern is still complaining about the Trumpeton Woods and the failure of the Duke to properly maintain the coverts so the foxes can be drawn. I say this knowing nothing about hunting, by the way. The Malls show up. You may remember Gerald and Adeline were in love but couldn't marry until Mrs. Finn arranged for part of her inheritance to be secretly channeled to Adeline as an inheritance. But now the mean old vain father has died, and so they have enough money to have some horses. But Gerald Mall is as lazy as ever. He can barely get up in time to go out on the hunt, and he's still languid and lazy. But really interesting to me, Mr. Spooner, who was an unsuccessful suitor for Adeline, somehow has a young hunting mad wife named Miss Leatherside, who takes care of him. And you may remember from Phineas that Mr. Spooner lived with his cousin who took care of the estate for him so he could hunt all the time. And he was so devastated by being rejected by Adeline that his brother, his cousin, kind of took him for a European tour and brought him back spanking new. And apparently, in a vulnerable moment, he fell in love with or proposed to Miss Leatherside, who is quite the talented huntress. And Lord Chiltern even consults with her from time to time. And of course, there's Phineas Finn. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the final disposition of Major Tifto, but needless to say, he gets him to write to Silverbridge about what Silverbridge's opinion is. Silverbridge, consulting with one of his advisors, decides not to take a position and decline to get involved. And Tifto is deposed, but they have to pay him some money, and so forth and so on. Okay. So just one more thing, and then I have a few questions. I don't know if anyone else noticed. I know you read the autobiography. I didn't join that, but I have read it. But Tregear is really sad because he's still convalescing on the opening day of the new session of Parliament. And he says to Lady Chiltern, formerly known as Violet Effingham, "Since I was a boy, just going up to school, it's been my dream to have a seat in Parliament. And now I've got it, I can't go there." Trollope, in his autobiography, says, "I've always thought that to sit in the British Parliament should be the highest ambition to every educated Englishman." And when his uncle once asked him what would he most like best of his destination for his future life, he remarked to be a member of Parliament, and his uncle sort of jeered and said few clerks in the post office become MPs. And you remember from the last set of chapters that the disagreeable conditions under which they have to go canvassing are loosely based on Trollope's own disheartening experience in Beverly. Okay, so with the remaining minute and a half that I have, I had just proposed some questions. I can also put them into the chat. But one of the questions, and talk about any that you want, what conversations or confrontations in these chapters engaged you the most, and why? Is Trollope persuasive on how the Duke seems to evolve in these chapters as he wrestles with his sense of duty versus love, and he wrestles with his failings as a parent? And to recap something I've already asked about, what does Trollope's treatment of Lady Mabel versus Isabel suggest about his views on women, love, and marriage? And this is just a joke question. Do you agree with me that Madame Max is one of Trollope's best characters and best people? In terms of the second question, I just note that when I was looking at some old criticism on this book, a 1958 essay by John Hagan calling The Duke's Children the Trollope's psychological masterpiece praised for its probing of the Duke's psychology and his social education as he navigates parenthood and his conflicts with his children. So I'll stop my share. I'll put the questions into the chat, and then I know Dominic wants to put us into small groups.